Alright, let's get started. Last time I started my review on the one and only Grand Theft Auto franchise with GTA 1, GTA London, and GTA 2. Now we move on to Grand Theft Auto 3, but before I start this review, let me give you a brief history lesson. Now we enter a completely different era. We enter a year that is considered arguably the best year in video game history, not only in terms of top-rated games and overall sales numbers, but is also considered the year that revolutionized the entire video game world. That year was 2001. In 2001, Sony's PS2 was ruling the market and was gaining even more strength after Sega dropped out of the console market. However, the market would not only welcome back Nintendo with its new GameCube, but a software giant would join the war as well, with Microsoft and its Xbox. By this point in time, DMA Design had been sold to Take-Two Interactive and was merged with Rockstar to become Rockstar North. Rockstar North's first venture would be Grand Theft Auto 3. Despite popular belief, there was a lot of worry on whether GTA 3 would be successful or not. The first couple of GTA games were only moderately successful. They weren't gigantic hits like the other popular franchises making their way to the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube. But it was obvious that Rockstar Games wanted GTA 3 to be a hit because the marketing campaign was huge. There wasn't any other game at the time that had more commercials than GTA 3. But was it worth it? Let's find out. With the previous GTA games, they had an overhead 2D perspective. With Grand Theft Auto 3, Rockstar went for a third-person 3D perspective, which was becoming very popular with video games at the time. The gameplay is largely the same, with stealing cars and completing missions, but this time, instead of a text message appearing at the bottom of the screen to give you your mission, the game now does full-length cutscenes with each character, which was very cool at the time. And the game has a little bit of a story of a man who has escaped from going to jail and now has to work for some of the toughest mobsters in the city known as Liberty City. The character you play doesn't say anything, while the characters he meets do all the talking. Most of the missions are pretty standard, with picking up people, killing people, stealing cars. A few missions do get a little more detailed, like bombing a ship, which is actually my favorite mission in the game. Outside of the missions, you can do a lot. The open world environment was improved even more over GTA 2. Now you can steal any car in the game, hit any person on the streets, and you can even look for prostitutes when the time in the game reaches night. With that being said, this is obviously not a kid's game. The gameplay was almost perfectly transferred from the 2D look of GTA 1 through 2 to the 3D look of GTA 3, but I use the word almost because it's still not perfect. The gameplay does come with a couple of noticeable flaws, the most noticeable being the fact that the game does lack a great deal of replay value once you complete the missions and the story is over. Despite the open world setting and despite the free range you have with that open world, there still isn't enough to make you really want to turn on the game once it's over. However, there are side missions. All the side missions are ways to help you gain more money, with my favorite being taxi driving. One of the common complaints that went towards GTA 3 after its release was that there wasn't enough to do other than stealing cars and killing people in Liberty City. Liberty City in GTA 3 is huge. It's a gigantic city that's modeled after New York City, and that winds up being the ultimate problem because you have this huge city with all these buildings and houses, and yet you can't access any of them. I think out of the entire city you can only access 4 or 5 of them. However, one of the big positive elements of the game is the length of the story and the amount of missions. If you're one that likes to take your time with the missions, you can easily make this a 30-hour game. So there's a way to make the game more lengthy and make the game's flaws a little less noticeable. Control-wise, the game is pretty well designed from that aspect. Button-wise, I think everything is great. No button feels weird or out of place, and all is easy to get used to from that standpoint. However, your character's reaction to the buttons is another story. One of the first things that took me a while to get used to was the navigation of the main character when on foot. It's nothing terrible, but turning the character is very loose. You can tap the D-pad slightly to the left or right, and your character will turn way too far for just that little tap. Now we move on to the driving controls, which sees the most change. With the previous game, it didn't matter what vehicle you had, it always drove the same with the speed and navigation. Grand Theft Auto 3 went for more realism, with all the different vehicles driving differently. First you have the regular cars, which drive normally, navigate and accelerate normally. Then you have the sports cars, which are fast as hell and tough to turn when you're going fast. Then there's the bigger vehicles like the semi-trucks, which are very slow but also tough to turn. Surprisingly, my favorite was the regular cars, especially when running from the cops. And that's another feature that got a huge update, and that's the Wanted level. GTA 2 took it to another level after GTA 1, but 3 expands on it even more. The Wanted level consists of 6 stars that appear on top of the screen. They start off black, but the more trouble you get into, each star slowly lights up. Instead of just endless cops chasing you, the cops now react more and more. They shoot at you, ram into your car, and if you light up enough stars, you actually have a helicopter chasing you, which is actually really cool. And last but not least, we move on to the graphics, which are a back-and-forth situation for Grand Theft Auto 3 on all versions. The first to come out was the PS2 version. The environments look spectacular, and the cars were recreated very well in the game. However, the biggest setback were the people. The people in the game, including the main character, looked incredibly blocky. They had baseball mitt-sized hands, and the animation on them weren't really that realistic. The Xbox version is almost the same with a few enhancements. One of the more noticeable differences is that the character models do look better. They're a little less blocky, and their hands are actually normal hands with fingers that move. The city itself and the cars also look a lot sharper. However, this came with a noticeable trade-off, and that's the fact that the game is slightly more glitchy. The characters' limbs are constantly going through walls, and some parts of the game do suffer from graphical pops. The PS2 had the same issue, but it was far less severe. The PC version, while less glitchy, is surprisingly not as good when it comes to the character models and the detail of the city when compared to the Xbox version, which is really surprising. However, where the PC excels at is the reflections and the weather patterns in the game. The rain looks better, and the lighting in the game is much better. Also, the sound is a little better than the console versions. So overall, GTA 3 was a great addition to the series, offering most of the same gameplay as well as some new gameplay with the new 3D environment. While there were flaws with these changes, there still was enough to keep it entertaining. Now we move on to Vice City. GTA Vice City takes the same gameplay design as GTA 3, but naturally expands on it. One of the big changes is with the story. As I stated before, there really was no plot with GTA 3, it was just really completing missions. With Vice City, they make a full-fledged story. You play a character named Tommy Vercetti. After a cocaine deal goes wrong, he has to overcome the consequences. You complete a series of missions to progress through the story, and like GTA 3, the story is told through cutscenes, but with Vice City, the missions also help tell the story as well. Also, like 3, you do missions for various people throughout the game. The game is based in the 1980s, and Vice City is based on Miami. The story itself and the entire look of the game does have a very Miami Vice feel to it, and it works out very well. Another huge improvement is with the open world. The main difference is that you can now go into more buildings, you can go into clubs, parking garages, you can go into hotels, and even a pizza place. However, to me, the most entertaining place to go into is the mall. It's a big place, and you can go into almost every store that's in it. And you can actually cause a lot of chaos in that place if you wanted to. My least favorite is actually the pizza place. While the clubs, the hotel, and the mall have a fair amount of interesting elements to them, the pizza place is really just a place you can walk into, but you can't really do anything once you're there. Vice City is noticeably smaller than Liberty City, but that ends up being a positive part about the game because it doesn't take long to get anywhere, and it's easy to remember where all the destinations are. The vehicles in the game also see a little bit of change. The way they handle aren't too different, but since the game is based in the 80s, the vehicles are all naturally from the 80s. One vehicle I forgot to mention with GTA 3 is the boat, which didn't play a particularly big role in that game. It plays a huge role here. The biggest addition for Vice City when it comes to its long list of vehicles is the motorcycle. The motorcycle does take some getting used to when it comes to the navigating. Obviously, there's a wide variety of bikes and all handle differently. For instance, you have the more sporty bikes, which are fast, while the bulkier Harleys are a little on the slow side. You might not want to run from the cops on these things because if you hit something, you're going to go flying off that bike. You also get the chance to control a helicopter. The helicopter is actually easy to fly, but it's a pain when shooting. It is so tough to aim when flying that helicopter. Graphically, the game does see some enhancements on all versions. The PS2 does look more detailed in terms of the environments, the lighting is better in the game. The only element that doesn't get much of an enhancement is the character models, which still aren't that great. The Xbox version sees enhancements as well, with the biggest enhancement being the many reflections in the game. You can see reflections off the cars, and my favorite is the reflection that appears on the mall floor. That's actually an amazing sight. However, the Xbox does have some severe loading time problems. Like the PS2, the game has to load when you cross over the bridge. However, the PS2 is rather short when it comes to the loading times, while the Xbox is longer for some reason. The PC version is very much like the Xbox version, with the biggest difference being the loading times. Another difference between the PC version and the console versions is the frame rate, which has been smoothed out. Not that it's terrible on the consoles, but it's easy to notice the difference, especially when driving all the vehicles. So overall, I love most of the new additions to the game. A couple of the new ideas have potential but don't really go anywhere, but that doesn't stop Vice City from being a better game than GTA 3. Now we move on to San Andreas.